The crash, the Eternal Axiom, was the most beautiful starship ever built by the Galactic Compact. And in 3 minutes, it would be nothing more than burning wreckage scattered across an alien world ambassador. Thalvax gripped the ceremonial rails of the bridge with all 6 of his pale blue appendages as the ship shook and screamed around him. And he watched the main viewing screen flash red with warning after warning as systems failed one after another like candles being blown out by a cruel wind. The bridge was chaos in its purest form, with Valkyrie officers shrieking their harmonic distress calls in frequencies that made the air itself vibrate, while the insectoid Chitrani pilots clicked and clattered at their stations in mounting panic as they tried desperately to regain control of the doomed vessel. In the corner of the bridge stood a single human, and his stillness was so complete that it seemed almost unnatural among the frantic movement of the alien crew. His name was Marcus Chun, and he was only 23 years old, a cadet from Earth who had been assigned to this prestigious vessel as part of a cultural exchange program between humanity and the elder races of the galaxy, where everyone else saw disaster and death approaching at terminal velocity. Marcus simply stood and watched and calculated impact in 40-time units. The ship's failing artificial intelligence announced in a voice that crackled with static and damage. Survival probability has dropped to 2.3% and continues to fall. The Eternal Axiom had been the pride of the Valkyrie Ascendancy for over 2,000 years. A vessel so advanced that other species had begged for centuries just to see its blueprints. And now it was falling out of the sky like a wounded bird. Something had gone wrong during the quantum fold jump. Some tiny miscalculation or perhaps sabotage that no one would ever be able to prove. And the ship had emerged from folded space directly in the atmosphere of Kepler 442b. Instead of in stable orbit above it, Marcus watched the ground rushing up to meet them through the flickering view screen. And his mind was already working on the problem of what would come next. He had read every technical manual about this ship during the long journey from Earth, all 400,000 pages of them, because humans got bored easily, and reading was better than staring at the walls of his small cabin. The other species on board had thought it strange that he would waste his time on such things, since the manuals were written for engineers who had studied for centuries, not for young cadets who had barely finished their basic training. But Marcus had read them anyway. And now, as the ship fell, he found himself thinking about hull compositions and power distribution networks and emergency protocols. Brace for impact, someone screamed. And Marcus grabbed onto the nearest solid object and tucked his chin against his chest. The Eternal Axiom hit the surface of Kepler 442b with a force that would have flattened a small city, carving a valley 3 kilometers long into the rocky terrain as it skidded and tumbled and broke apart. Marcus felt his body slam against something hard, and then against something else, and then the world became a spinning nightmare of noise and pain, and the screech of tearing metal. When the movement finally stopped, he found himself lying in a pile of debris with blood running down his face from a deep gash on his forehead. And for a long moment, he simply lay there and breathed and confirmed that he was still alive. The air tasted wrong, filled with smoke and chemical fumes and the sharp tang of leaking coolant. And Marcus knew that he needed to move before the atmosphere became too toxic to breathe. He pushed himself up through the wreckage, shoving aside twisted metal panels and sparking cables. And when he finally stood on shaking legs, he saw the full extent of the disaster. Around him, the beautiful Eternal Axiom was destroyed, its elegant curves now jagged edges, and its pristine hull now blackened and torn. And through the gaps in the broken walls, Marcus could see the alien sky of Kepler 442b, purple and orange, and filled with clouds that looked like bruises. Bodies lay scattered among the debris, some moving weakly and others completely still. And Marcus felt his heart clench at the sight of so much death and injury. but he did not freeze. And he did not panic, because humans had evolved on a world that tried to kill them every single day. And responding to disaster was written into their very bones. He started moving through the wreckage, checking on survivors and pulling the wounded free from the debris. And as he worked, his mind was already cataloging everything he saw. There was the main power coupling, cracked but possibly salvageable. And over there was the secondary life support unit, damaged but not destroyed. And if he squinted, he could see the edge of the quantum fold drive housing through a hole in the ceiling. The drive itself was probably ruined, but the housing might still contain useful components. And Marcus filed that information away for later. Ambassador Thalvex emerged from beneath a fallen support beam, his pale blue skin now stained with purple blood from a dozen small wounds. And his large, dark eyes found Marcus with an expression of pure bewilderment. "Human," the ambassador said in a voice that trembled with shock and pain. "Human, what are you doing?" "Checking for survivors," Marcus replied without stopping his work. "We need to get everyone who can move to a central location and assess our situation." "Our situation?" Thalvex repeated slowly, as if the words made no sense to him. "Our situation is that we are stranded on a hostile world with a destroyed ship and no hope of rescue for many cycles. Our situation is death." Marcus paused just long enough to look the ambassador in the eyes, and something in his gaze made the ancient alien flinch. "Maybe," Marcus said. And then he turned back to his work and pulled another groaning Chitrani free from beneath a pile of twisted metal. "But probably not." The ambassador stared at the young human as he moved through the devastation with purpose and efficiency. And for the first time in his very long life, Thalvex felt something that he had never experienced before. He felt like he did not understand what he was seeing, like the universe had suddenly revealed that it operated on rules. He had never been taught. Marcus Chun was bleeding and bruised and covered in dust and debris. Just a young mammal from a backwater planet that had only achieved spaceflight a few centuries ago. And yet he moved through the wreckage of the greatest ship ever built as built. If the disaster was merely a problem to be solved, Thalvex watched him work. And somewhere deep in his secondary heart, a small spark of something that might have been hope began to glow perhaps. The ambassador thought to himself as he struggled to his feet and began to help. Perhaps the Deathworlder knew something that the rest of them did not. The assessment, the surviving crew of the Eternal Axiom, gathered in what had once been the ship's grand ceremonial hall, though now it was little more than a broken shell with half its ceiling missing and alien sky visible through the gaps. There were 37 of them in total, and Marcus counted them as they assembled with the careful attention of someone who knew that every single life mattered. 12 Valkyrie had survived, their tall, graceful forms now hunched and wounded, their pale blue skin marked with purple bruises and cuts that they tried to hide behind what remained of their dignity. 8 Chitrani had made it through the crash, their insectoid bodies proving surprisingly resilient despite their delicate appearance, though several of them had lost limbs or antennae and clicked in constant pain. 16 Ulthik had survived, which was not surprising since the gelatinous beings were extremely difficult to kill, and they had simply reformed themselves after the impact and oozed their way to the gathering point. And then there was Marcus, the only human, standing among the alien survivors with dried blood on his face and a look in his eyes that none of them could quite understand. Ambassador Thalvex had taken charge of the group, as was his right and duty, and he stood before them now with his shoulders slumped in defeat as he delivered his assessment of their situation. "Fellow travelers," he began in a voice heavy with grief, "I must be honest with you about what we face, and I ask that you receive this news with the dignity befitting your species." The survivors fell silent, their various forms of attention all focused on the ambassador as he continued. "The Eternal Axiom is destroyed beyond any hope of repair, and we are stranded on Kepler 442b. A world that was never meant to support our forms of life for extended periods. He paused and let that sink in before continuing with the full weight of despair in his voice. A rescue beacon. If we could construct one, would take 3 full cycles to reach the nearest outpost. And a response would take another 3 cycles to return to us. But we have supplies for perhaps 1 cycle at most. Murmurs of fear rippled through the gathered survivors. And the Chitrani clicked in distress while the Ulfek quivered with anxiety. Furthermore, Thalvex continued, the atmosphere of this world contains elements that are corrosive to our environmental suits and breathing apparatus. And my calculations suggest that our equipment will fail within half a cycle. The murmurs became cries of despair. And several of the Velkari began their morning songs. High-keying notes that spoke of lives cut short and journeys left incomplete. Marcus listened to all of this with his arms crossed over his chest and his head tilted slightly to one side. And when the ambassador finished speaking, the human stepped forward. So we fixed the ship, he said. And his voice cut through the morning songs like a knife through silk. Every eye and sensor and perception organ in the room turned toward him. And for a long moment there was complete silence. Ambassador Thalvex stared at the human with an expression that mixed confusion with something that might have been pity. Young Deathworlder, the ambassador said gently, as if speaking to a child who did not understand the situation, I appreciate your optimism. But you must understand what you are suggesting. Senior Engineer Crystal stepped forward, her chitinous body clicking and clacking as she moved. And she had been the head of engineering for the Eternal Axiom for over 180 years. Human, she said through the translator that rendered her clicks into spoken words. This vessel represents the accumulated knowledge and effort of the entire Galactic Compact. And it took our greatest minds 4,000 standard years to design the systems that power this ship. She gestured with several of her limbs toward the devastation around them. The construction itself required 200 years of careful work, with materials gathered from across 1,000 star systems and assembled by artisans who trained for their entire lives just to be worthy of the task. Her compound eyes fixed on Marcus with what might have been amusement or contempt. You cannot simply fix this ship, young one, any more than you could simply fix a broken star or rebuild a shattered planet. Marcus did not flinch under her gaze. And when he spoke, his voice was calm and steady. I read the technical manuals during the journey here, he said. All of them, every single page. Because I was bored and there was nothing else to do. This statement caused a ripple of surprise through the assembled aliens. And Crystal's antennae twitched, in what the translator interpreted as disbelief. The technical manuals for this vessel comprise over 400,000 pages of complex engineering theory and practice, she said slowly. Material that takes our engineers decades to fully comprehend. I read fast, Marcus replied with a shrug. And I have some ideas about how we might get out of here. Ambassador Thalvex raised one of his appendages in a gesture that requested patience. Human Marcus, I do not doubt your intelligence or your determination. But what you are suggesting is simply impossible. And false hope will only make our final hours more painful. Marcus looked around the room at the gathered survivors, at the fear in their eyes and the despair in their postures. And something in his expression hardened. Let me ask you something, he said, addressing all of them now. How long did it take your species to develop faster than light travel? The question seemed to confuse them. And it was Crystal who finally answered. The Velkari achieved quantum fold technology approximately 12,000 years ago. After 6,000 years of theoretical development and experimentation, Marcus nodded slowly. Humans achieved it in 200 years. From the first theoretical papers to working prototypes. And we did it while also fighting 3 world wars and nearly destroying our own planet twice. The silence that followed was different from before. charged with something that none of the aliens could quite name. "We come from a death world," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. "A planet that has tried to kill us in every possible way since the first moment of our existence. And we survived, and we thrived, and we reached the stars, not because we had time to do things carefully, but because we never had enough time and had to figure things out fast or die." He pointed toward the wreckage visible through the broken walls. "That ship out there is broken. Yes, but it is not gone, and the physics that made it work are still the same physics. And I have read your manuals, and I understand your technology. And I am telling you that I can get us off this planet." Crickstall made a sound that the translator rendered as skeptical. "Laughter. And how long do you estimate this impossible repair will take?" Young human Marcus looked at the wreckage, his eyes moving over the scattered components and damaged systems with the focus of someone who was already working on the problem. "Half an hour," he said. "Maybe less." The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear the wind whistling through the broken hull of the ship, and then, very slowly, Ambassador Thalvex began to laugh. A sound that started as disbelief and gradually transformed into something that might have been hope. "Show us." "Deathworlder," the ambassador said, spreading his appendages wide in a gesture of acceptance. "Show us what your impossible species can do." The work, What Happened Next, would become legend across 17 star systems. Told and retold in spacer bars and academy halls and the quiet chambers where engineers gathered to discuss the impossible. Marcus Chun moved through the wreckage of the eternal axiom like a force of nature, like a storm that had taken human form, and everywhere he went things began to change. He started at the main power coupling, the massive system that had taken Valkyrie engineers 50 years to design and another 30 to build. And he looked at it for exactly 12 seconds before he began to work. "This is over-engineered," he announced to no one in particular as his hands dove into the damaged machinery. "You have 17 redundant systems here when 3 would do the job, and half of these are still functional." Senior engineer Crickstall followed him with her compound eyes wide and her mandibles hanging open in shock. "Those redundancies are required by the sacred engineering principles," she protested. "They ensure perfect reliability across all possible conditions." "Perfect reliability does not help us if we are dead," Marcus replied without looking up. "Right now I need good enough reliability for 1 flight. And good enough I can give you." His hands moved with a speed and precision that seemed almost impossible, pulling out damaged components and rerouting power through pathways that the original designers had never intended. Within 2 minutes, the main power coupling hummed back to life, running at perhaps 60% capacity, but running nonetheless. "That should not work," Crickstall said, her voice barely a whisper. "The harmonic frequencies are completely wrong. Wrong for long-term use." Marcus agreed as he was already moving to the next system. "Fine for getting us to orbit." He conscripted every able body among the survivors, assigning tasks with the rapid-fire efficiency of someone who had no time to waste on explanations or arguments. The Ulthik, with their malleable gelatinous bodies, became living sealant for the hundreds of hull breaches that dotted the damaged ship, flowing into gaps and cracks and hardening themselves into temporary patches. "This is undignified," one of the Ulthik complained, as it squeezed itself into a particularly tight breach. "Dignity can wait until we are not dying," Marcus called back. Already moving past, the Valkyrie, with their natural telekinetic abilities, found themselves pressed into service holding components in place while Marcus welded and connected and improvised. Ambassador Thalvex himself stood for 20 minutes with all 6 appendages extended, using his mental powers to keep 3 separate hull plates aligned while the human worked around him with a plasma torch. "I have not performed manual labor in 400 years, the ambassador said through gritted teeth. Consider it a cultural experience. Marcus replied as sparks flew around them, the Chitrani. Despite their constant protests, that what Marcus was doing violated every principle of proper engineering, found themselves following his instructions with increasing speed and decreasing complaints. Crick still worked beside him for a time, watching in horrified fascination as he took apart systems she had spent decades maintaining, and rebuilt them in ways that made her compound eyes twitch. The quantum fold drive, she said, when they reached the most damaged section of the ship. It uses crystalline matrices that were grown over hundreds of years in zero-gravity conditions, and those matrices are shattered beyond any hope of repair. Marcus knelt beside the ruined drive and examined the fragments of crystal that lay scattered across the deck, like broken dreams. "Tell me how it works," he said. "Not the official explanation, not the theoretical framework. Just tell me what it actually does." Crick still hesitated, because the quantum fold drive was considered sacred technology and its inner workings were closely guarded secrets, but they were dying on an alien world with no hope of rescue. So she told him, the crystals resonate at specific frequencies that create a fold in the fabric of space, she explained. The exact frequency patterns took our scientists 3,000 years to discover, and another 1,000 too. Perfect. Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes still on the crystal fragments. So it is frequency resonance, he said, more to himself than to her. The crystals are just a medium for generating specific frequencies. And if I can replicate those frequencies through other means, then I do not need the crystals at all. He began gathering the shattered crystal fragments, sorting them by size and color with rapid movements. "I need conductive paste," he announced. "Something that can carry electrical current and hold a shape." "We have emergency hull sealant," one of the Valkyrie offered. "It contains metallic particles for structural reinforcement." "That will work. Bring me all of it." Crickstall watched in growing disbelief as Marcus arranged the crystal fragments in a pattern she had never seen before. A complex geometric design that seemed to fold back on itself in impossible ways. "What is that pattern?" she asked, Penrose tiling. Marcus replied without looking up. "It is a mathematical concept from Earth, a way of filling space with shapes that never quite repeat. And if I am right about the frequency resonance, then this arrangement should create interference patterns that approximate what your full crystals did." "That is insane," Crickstall said. "Probably," Marcus agreed. "We will find out in a few minutes." He mixed the hull sealant with metallic shavings scraped from the broken hull and used the resulting paste to connect the crystal fragments in his strange pattern. The whole assembly looked nothing like the elegant crystalline structure that had originally powered the drive, and it resembled more a piece of abstract art created by someone with no formal training. But when Marcus connected it to the backup power supply and ran a test current through the system, the quantum fold drive housing began to hum. It was not the pure clean tone that the drive had produced before, more like a rough growl with harmonic overtones that made Crickstall's exoskeleton vibrate uncomfortably. "That sound is wrong," she said. "But it is working," Marcus replied with the first smile he had shown since the crash. Wrong and working is better than right and dead. He did not sleep as he worked, did not pause for food or water or rest. And when Ambassador Thalvex approached him to suggest that humans required periodic unconsciousness to function properly, Marcus simply shook his head. "I will rest when we are off this rock," he said. "Until then, there is work to do." 15 minutes into the repairs, he had jury-rigged the life support system to filter the toxic atmosphere and provide breathable air to the survivors. 20 minutes in, he had bypassed the destroyed navigation computer entirely, routing all essential controls through his personal datapad with a series of improvised connections that made the Chitrani Engineers twitch with anxiety. 25 minutes in the main drive of the Eternal Axiom. Rebuilt using principles that violated 3 laws the Galactic Compact had considered fundamental to physics. Hummed to life and filled the broken ship with vibration and hope, Marcus stood in the center of the ruined bridge, covered in burns and cuts and substances that no one could identify. And he looked at what he had built with the critical eye of someone who knew that almost good enough was not the same as actually good enough. 5 more minutes, he announced, to the exhausted survivors who had gathered to watch. We need to reinforce the structural integrity of the forward hull section, or we will break apart during atmospheric exit. And then he was moving again. And the aliens followed, because by now they had learned that when the Deathworlder said something would work, it usually did, even if it should not have been possible. The revelation at the 28-minute mark. Ambassador. Thalvex found Marcus welding the final hull plate into place on the forward section of what had once been the Eternal Axiom. The cadet's hands were burned and blistered from working with the plasma torch. His uniform was soaked with blood and coolant and half a dozen other substances that the ambassador could not identify. And his eyes were red with exhaustion and chemical exposure, but his hands were steady. And the weld he was laying down was clean, and True Thalvex stood beside him in silence for a long moment, watching the human work with a focus that seemed almost inhuman in its intensity. And when Marcus finally stepped back and examined his work, the ambassador spoke the only word that he could summon. "How?" he asked. And his voice carried 400 years of education and experience, and the absolute certainty that what he had witnessed was impossible. Marcus wiped sweat from his eyes with the back of one burned hand and turned to look at the ambassador. "How what?" he asked. "How did you do this?" Thalvex gestured at the rebuilt ship around them, at the jury-rigged systems and improvised repairs, and the quantum fold drive that hummed with its strange rough tone. "How did you take a vessel that represented the greatest achievement of our civilization and rebuild it in less time than it takes me to compose a formal greeting?" Marcus leaned against a bulkhead and let out a long breath. And for just a moment, the exhaustion showed through the determination. "Humans come from a death world," he said, as if that explained everything. "Do you know what that means?" "Ambassador," Thalvex nodded slowly. "I have read the reports. And your planet Earth is classified as a Category 12 hazard world with extreme gravity, toxic atmosphere, dangerous wildlife, and unstable geological conditions. It is worse than the reports suggest," Marcus said with something that might have been a smile. "Our planet tries to kill us every single day. And it has been trying since the first moment our ancestors crawled out of the oceans and onto the land." He looked down at his burned hands. "Our entire evolutionary history is built on solving impossible problems before they kill us. And we do not have the luxury of taking millennia to grow perfect crystals or centuries to design perfect systems. Because if we took that long, we would be dead." "But the quantum principles," Thalvex protested. "The resonance harmonics, these are not things that can be approximated or rushed." Marcus shook his head, with respect. "Ambassador, that is exactly the kind of thinking that made this repair seem impossible to you." He pointed at the rebuilt quantum fold drive visible through a gap in the deck plating. "Your ancestors built a symphony when a drumbeat would carry the message just as far. And your crystals and your carefully grown matrices and your centuries of refinement, all of that produces a beautiful and elegant solution to the problem of folding space. And what you built?" Thalvex asked. "I built a drumbeat," Marcus replied. "It is ugly and rough, and it makes sounds that probably violate several aesthetic principles that your people hold sacred. But it does the same job, and it does it well enough to get us home." Senior Engineer Crickstel approached them, her compound eyes flickering with calculations that she had been running for the past several minutes. "I have analyzed your repairs," She said to Marcus, "And I need you to understand that what you have done should not be possible according to every principle of engineering that we have developed over the past 10,000 years. Does it work?" Marcus asked Crix, though made a clicking sound that the translator rendered as frustrated acknowledgement. "Yes, it works. But the modifications are inherently unstable, and the systems you have created are running at tolerances that would never be approved by any certification body in the compact." "How many jumps do we have?" Marcus asked. "Perhaps 10 before catastrophic failure. Maybe fewer if the resonance patterns destabilize. We only need one," Marcus said, pushing himself off the bulkhead and standing straight despite his obvious exhaustion. "One jump to the nearest outpost. And then you can tow this wreck into a proper repair dock and spend the next century fixing it properly." He looked at the ambassador and the engineer with an awe expression that was not pride or arrogance, but simply the calm confidence of someone who had done what needed to be done. "The galaxy is full of species that have had millions of years to develop their technology," he said. "You have had time to find the perfect solutions, to grow the perfect crystals, to engineer the perfect systems, and humanity has not," Dalvik said slowly. "Beginning to understand, we had a few thousand years at most. And for most of that time, we were too busy trying not to starve or freeze or get eaten by predators to focus on anything else. And when we finally reached the stars, we did it not because we had perfected the science, but because we figured out what worked well enough to get us there." Cricksdale's mandibles clicked in what might have been reluctant admiration. "You are saying that your species' strength is not superior intelligence or advanced technology." "Our strength is desperation," Marcus replied, "and the stubborn refusal to accept that something is impossible just because it has never been done before." Ambassador Thalvax looked at the young human, really looked at him for perhaps the first time since they had met, and he saw something that he had missed before behind. The exhaustion and the burns and the blood-stained uniform was a will that burned like a star. An absolute refusal to surrender to circumstances, no matter how dire they seemed. This was what made humans dangerous, he realized. Not their physical resilience or their quick thinking, but their utter unwillingness to accept defeat. "Your species frightens me," the ambassador said quietly. "And I mean that as the highest possible compliment," Marcus laughed. A short, tired sound that held no malice. "We frighten ourselves sometimes," he admitted. "Now let us get off this planet before my repairs fall apart." He moved toward what remained of the bridge, and after a moment, the ambassador and the engineer followed behind them. The rebuilt Eternal Axiom hummed and groaned and made sounds that would have caused any proper engineer to weep. But it held together, and sometimes holding together was all that mattered. The legend, the thing that had once been the Eternal Axiom, rose from the surface of Kepler 442b exactly 31 minutes after it had crashed. And it was perhaps the ugliest spacecraft that had ever achieved flight in the history of the Galactic Compact, where the original vessel had been sleek and elegant. A masterpiece of form and function that had inspired poetry and art across 100 worlds. This rebuilt version was a patchwork nightmare of salvaged hull plating, emergency sealant, and what appeared to be pure stubborn determination holding it all together. Ulfik, who had sealed themselves into the hull breaches, quivered uncomfortably as the ship shook and rattled around them. And several of them made formal complaints about the indignity of being used as living patch material. Valkyrie officers clung to whatever solid surfaces they could find as the deck pitched and swayed beneath them. And more than one of them began reciting prayers to deities they had not believed in for centuries. The Chitrani covered their audio receptors with their foremost limbs, trying to block out the horrible grinding howl of the quantum fold drive, as it prepared to tear a hole in the fabric of space using methods that violated everything they had ever been taught about physics and At the center of it all stood Marcus Chun, his burned hands moving across the improvised control interface he had built from his personal datapad and salvaged components, guiding the wounded ship upward through the purple and orange clouds of the alien atmosphere, hull integrity at 47%. Crickstall announced from her position at what remained of the engineering station. Structural stress is approaching critical thresholds. We only need to hold together for another few minutes, Marcus replied, his eyes fixed on the screen that showed their trajectory. Once we clear the atmosphere, the stress will drop significantly. The ship groaned around them as if in protest. And somewhere in the depths of the vessel, something made a loud snapping sound that caused everyone except Marcus to flinch. What was that? Ambassador Thalvex demanded. Probably one of the secondary support struts, Marcus said without looking away from his controls. We have 11 more, so we can afford to lose a few. You are insane, one of the Velkari officers whispered. And Marcus did not argue the point. The ship broke through the upper atmosphere with a final shudder that knocked several crew members off their feet. And then suddenly they were in space, surrounded by the cold, dark beauty of the void between worlds. We made it, someone said, their voice filled with disbelief. Not yet, Marcus replied. Now comes the hard part. He entered the coordinates for outpost Valkyrie 7 into his improvised navigation system and began the sequence to activate the quantum fold drive. The drive responded with a sound that Crickstall later described as similar to a large predator being tortured, a deep growling howl that seemed to resonate in the bones of everyone aboard. That is not right, she said, her compound eyes flickering with alarm. It does not have to be right, Marcus replied. It just has to work. He engaged the drive for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Nothing happened, and Marcus felt his heart stop as he wondered if he had finally pushed too far, asked for too much from a ship that had already given everything, and space folded around them, and the universe twisted itself into shapes that should not have existed, and the horrible wounded ship that had once been the eternal axiom vanished from orbit around. Kepler 442 BIT reappeared 3 seconds later in the space near outpost Valkyrie 7, trailing sparks and venting atmosphere from a dozen imperfect seals, looking like nothing so much as a creature that had crawled out of a nightmare. This is outpost Valkyrie 7 to unidentified vessel. A voice crackled over the communication system. Please identify yourself and explain your condition. Ambassador Thalvex stepped forward and activated the response channel. This is Ambassador Thalvex of the Eternal Axiom, requesting immediate emergency docking, and I have a very long story to tell you. A ship landed more than it docked, scraping along the station's emergency berth in a maneuver that would give the traffic controllers nightmares for the rest of their careers. And when it finally came to rest, there was a long moment of silence on the bridge. Then someone cheered, and then everyone was cheering. And even the Ulfik, who were still serving as hull patches, managed to quiver in celebration. All 37 crew members had survived, and not a single life had been lost to the impossible disaster that should have killed them. All Marcus Chen stood quietly amid the celebration, his exhaustion finally catching up with him now that the work was done. And when Ambassador Thalvex approached him, the human could barely keep his eyes open. I do not know how to thank you, the ambassador said, and I do not think there are words in any language I know that would be adequate. No thanks necessary, Marcus replied with a tired smile. I was just doing what needed to be done. In the years that followed, the story of what Marcus Chun had accomplished spread across the galaxy like wildfire. The Galactic Compact's High Engineering Council spent the next decade studying his modifications, and they eventually produced a 4,000-page report that concluded what he had done was theoretically impossible, practically inadvisable, and spectacularly effective, they also noted. With considerable academic unease, that he had apparently invented 3 new engineering principles in the process. Seemingly by accident while trying to solve more immediate problems, the Volcari added a new chapter to their sacred engineering texts, one that discussed the concept of sufficient solutions and acknowledged that perfection was not always necessary when survival was at stake. The Chitrani revised their entire theoretical framework for quantum mechanics, incorporating the principles that Marcus had stumbled upon in his desperate improvisation. And across the galaxy, a new saying emerged among the spacefaring species, one that was spoken in bars and academies and the quiet spaces between stars: never crash with a human aboard. The saying went, because they will fix your ship, but you will never be able to look at it the same way again. As for Marcus Chen himself, he returned to Earth after his exchange program concluded and took a job as a maintenance technician at a recycling plant in Wisconsin when reporters tracked him down and asked about his famous repair. He reportedly shrugged and said something that would be quoted for generations. It was not that impressive, he told them. Anyone could have died if they stopped worrying about doing it right and focused on doing it now. He lived out the rest of his days in quiet obscurity, fixing broken machines and solving small problems. And he never sought fame or recognition for what he had done, but somewhere in the vastness of space, in the halls of power and the depths of engineering laboratories and the hearts of 37 beings who owed him their lives, the legend of Marcus Chen continued to grow, and whenever a disaster struck and all hope seemed lost, someone would always remember the Deathworlder Cadet who had rebuilt a crashed alien warship in 30 minutes. They would remember, and they would refuse to give up. Because if a single exhausted human could do the impossible, then surely anything was possible for those with the courage to try. That was the true legacy of Marcus Chen. Not the engineering principles, or the repaired ship, or the academic papers written about his accomplishments. His legacy was hope. The stubborn human belief that no problem was truly unsolvable, and no situation was truly hopeless, and that, perhaps, was the most human thing of all.